The tower was supposed to be a simple project at least. That's what Dean Tavik of the Xallari Academy had told everyone. It was meant to be a hands-on training exercise for the alien students. Construct a freestanding structure at least 100 meters tall out of indigenous materials on Earth. No anti-gravity rigs, no molecular stabilizers, no orbital scaffolds. Just stone, metal, wood, and sweat. The chosen site was a dusty, half-forgotten patch of Nevada desert. Supplies were trucked in by the Academy's Earth Liaison Office. A handful of curious locals hovered at the perimeter fence, sipping iced tea and placing informal bets on how long the project would take before collapsing. Quentin O'Connell leaned against the back of his battered red truck, arms crossed, chewing on a piece of straw he'd picked up on the drive over. He wasn't here for the betting pool. He'd been hired as a consulting structural specialist, a title that sounded far fancier than what he really was. A rural engineer who knew how to get heavy things to stay standing without fancy tech. Tavik floated literally over to him, his round, gelatinous body bobbing slightly in the hot breeze. His translator unit buzzed against his side. "Quentin O'Connell," Tavik said, his voice crackling slightly, "we are prepared to begin the raising." Quentin spat the straw into the dust and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "All right. Let's see what you got, Professor." The students, a mix of species from across the Orion Spur, gathered around, each wearing a bright orange vest with cadet printed in 3 languages. They began hauling massive stone blocks into position, stacking them in a broad, circular base. Quentin watched for a full hour without saying a word. The base was too wide, the core too hollow. He could see it already. They were building up, but without a proper center of mass, it would start bowing outward the moment they reached about 20 meters. A student tall, 6-limbed, slate-skinned dropped a block onto the growing pile. It landed with a thud that sent a shudder through the entire structure. Quentin whistled low. "That thing's gonna pancake faster than a drunk on roller skates." Tavik hovered closer. "Pardon, nothing," Quentin said, pushing off the truck. He walked toward the construction, boots kicking up little puffs of dust. "You're not using any leverage, no internal supports, no tension rings. You're just stacking." "That is the method prescribed in the Academy's curriculum for primitive construction," Tavik said, sounding mildly defensive. Quentin rubbed his jaw. "Yeah, well, on Earth, we figured out pretty quick that if you just pile rocks, you wind up with a pile of rocks and a lot of dead guys underneath it." Tavik's gelatinous skin pulsed an irritated purple. Quentin ignored it. "All right, let's see how far you get." "I'll be over there when you need me." The students worked through the afternoon, sweating and panting or whatever the alien equivalents were as they stacked block after block. Quentin set up a folding chair under a sunshade and cracked open a lukewarm soda. By dusk, the tower stood about 30 meters tall and it was already listing to one side like a ship taking on water. The lead builder, a barrel-chested Ralvani named Jorek, barked orders in a language that sounded like a dog chewing gravel. Quentin didn't interfere. He just watched. At exactly 7:13 p.m., the inevitable happened. With a grinding groan, the tower leaned a few degrees too far. One of the bottom stones cracked. The whole structure shuddered once, twice, and then collapsed in a roaring avalanche of dust and debris. Tavik floated over to Quentin's chair, looking like someone had just kicked his puppy. "We request your consultation." Quentin took another sip of soda before standing up. "All right, Professor. Let's build you a tower that won't kill half your class." The next morning, Quentin paced in front of the assembled students, a coil of thick rope slung over his shoulder. He drew a rough diagram in the dirt with a stick. "You want height, you need a strong base and a tight core. And you're gonna need leverage." Jorek folded his massive arms. "Explain this." "Leverage." Quentin dropped the rope and grabbed a nearby rock. He wedged a scrap of wood under it and used a longer stick to lift the stone effortlessly. Bigger the lever, less force you need to move weight. Same principle applies to stability. We're gonna use tension cables inside the tower. Anchor them deep into the ground, tie them to the upper levels, pull the weight inward. Tavik's translator buzzed. You propose augmenting the primitive construction with mechanical advantage. Quentin grinned. Exactly. The students were skeptical, but after a quick demonstration, they got on board. Quentin assigned teams, diggers for the anchor pits, riggers for the cables, lifters for the blocks. He showed them how to weave the interior supports in a crisscross pattern, distributing the load along multiple axes. The work was brutal. By noon, Quentin's shirt was soaked through with sweat. He barked instructions, adjusted pulley systems, and tightened ropes until his hands were raw. At one point, a pulley snapped and a block nearly crushed one of the students, a wiry, insectile creature named Xallari. Quentin Dove yanked Xallari out of the way and took a glancing blow to his ribs. He lay on the ground for a moment, grimacing. Tavik floated over. "Are you damaged?" "Maybe a little," Quentin said through gritted teeth. He insisted on finishing the day's work, but by nightfall the pain was bad enough that Tavik called a medic. A portable scanner revealed no fractures, just deep bruising. Still, Quentin was ordered to rest for 48 hours. He spent the time pacing like a caged animal, barking advice from the sidelines. The students adapted quickly. Using Quentin's methods, they rebuilt the tower's base, this time with internal tension lines and a tighter, more balanced design. As the days passed, the structure rose 40 meters, then 60, then 80. At one point, a dust storm rolled in, battering the tower with 70-kilometer-per-hour winds. Quentin watched anxiously from the shelter, heart pounding. The tower swayed, cables creaking under the strain, but it held. When the skies cleared, the students cheered. Quentin just nodded. "Good, now let's make it even taller." Tavik blinked. "The assignment requires only 100 meters, Quentin grinned. "Yeah, but wouldn't it be something to leave a mark?" He pulled out a rough sketch he'd made during his forced rest. A narrower spire rising from the main tower, supported by additional leverage braces and guy wires anchored 100 meters out in a wide circle. "It'll be twice as tall." "Maybe more," Tavik hesitated. "Such ambition is risky," Quentin shrugged. "Yeah, that's what makes it worth doing." After a long pause, Tavik gave a slow, gelatinous nod. The students threw themselves into the next phase with renewed energy. Quentin showed them how to build wooden cranes powered by counterweights. They fashioned stronger tension cables by braiding native fibers together. Every evening, Quentin walked the perimeter, checking anchors, adjusting lines, muttering calculations under his breath. 3 weeks in, the tower passed the 100-meter mark and kept going. At 120 meters, a support cable snapped during a lift. Quentin was there in seconds, shouting for everyone to back away. He rigged a temporary brace with scavenged pipe and a stripped-down winch, stabilizing the section until a permanent fix could be installed. The incident left him with a nasty cut along his forearm, deep enough to need stitches. He sat grimacing on a crate while a medic patched him up. "You humans are remarkably fragile," Tavik observed. Quentin grunted. "Yeah, and stubborn enough to make up for it." By the end of the 6th week, the tower stood 204 meters tall, a lancing spire of stone and wood and blood and sweat against the endless blue sky. The students gathered at the base, staring up in awe. Quentin limped to the front, still favoring his bruised ribs and stitched arm. Tavik floated beside him. "Your methods have achieved results beyond expectation." Quentin chuckled. "Just a little leverage, Professor." The Academy's inspection team arrived 2 days later. They circled the tower with scanners and drones, muttering to themselves. Finally, the lead inspector, a gaunt, metallic-skinned being named Xallari, turned to Tavik. "This construction exceeds the parameters of the assignment. It demonstrates ingenuity, adaptability, and resilience." Tavik's gelatinous body flushed a brilliant gold. "We accept the evaluation." Quentin leaned on his cane and grinned up at the tower. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't elegant. But it was strong, and it was going to stay standing for a long, long time. The morning after the inspection, Quentin sat on an overturned bucket at the base of the tower. threading a fresh length of hemp rope through a battered pulley. His ribs ached worse in the cool air, and the stitches on his arm itched under the bandage. He kept working anyway. Across the site, the alien students milled around in groups, their usual urgency replaced by a strange, jittery energy. Xallari approached, his heavy boots sending up little puffs of dust. "Human Quentin, there is a matter requiring your judgment." Quentin looked up, squinting against the rising sun. "What's wrong now? There is disagreement among the crews. Some wish to dismantle the tower to study the construction phases. Others wish to leave it intact as a testament." Quentin wiped his palms on his jeans and stood, joints creaking. "You're telling me they want to tear it down after all that work?" Xallari's thick shoulders lifted in a shrug. "It is customary among certain academies to deconstruct after assessment." "Well, that's a real shame," Quentin said. He grabbed the pulley and started walking toward the gathering crowd. "Let's go settle this." The students parted as he approached. Quentin caught sight of Xallari's spindly frame perched halfway up the first level of scaffolding, legs quivering in agitation. Tavik floated nearby, his body shifting to a cautious orange. "All right," Quentin said, planting himself in the center. "Who's voting to take it down?" About half the students raised their hands, appendages, or whatever counted as hands for their species. Quentin nodded slowly. "And who wants to leave it up?" The others responded, some a little more hesitantly. Tavik's translator clicked. "The division is nearly equal." Quentin scratched the back of his neck. "We could flip a coin." Several students looked utterly baffled. A few whispered hurried translations to others. Xallari frowned. "What is this coin?" Quentin pulled a battered quarter from his pocket and held it up. "It's got two sides, heads and tails. You flip it, call it in the air, fate decides." An insectoid cadet with gleaming black carapace leaned in. "You entrust decisions of importance to random chance." "Sometimes," Quentin said, flipping the coin lazily and catching it. "Beats standing around arguing all day." Tavik pulsed a muted green. "We require a less arbitrary method," Quentin sighed. "All right, then we do it the hard way." He gestured for the students to form two groups. When they'd sorted themselves, he walked between them, studying faces, wings, fronds, and scales. "You know how we decide stuff on Earth when it matters?" Quentin asked. The students leaned closer, curious. "We argue." Loud. "Until somebody makes a better point or everyone's too tired to keep fighting." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "So," Quentin said, "start talking." Xallari stepped forward first. "Deconstruction allows for analysis. We can replicate success only through thorough examination." Xallari clambered down the scaffolding, jittering with urgency. "Preservation inspires. Future classes will see what is possible." Another cadet, a soft-bodied being covered in iridescent plumes, added, "This tower is a testament to overcoming failure. Destroying it would erase that." A heavy-set reptilian student countered, "Without deconstruction, the techniques may decay into legend rather than reproducible knowledge." The argument escalated quickly, voices rising, gestures growing wilder. Quentin leaned against a support beam, sipping lukewarm water from a dented canteen, letting them hash it out. After nearly an hour, a consensus began to form. They would preserve the main tower but construct a smaller, secondary model nearby specifically for study. Tavik floated higher, his skin brightening to an approving gold. Quentin clapped his hands together. "There, now you're thinking like builders." Later that afternoon, after the plans were finalized, Quentin wandered toward the medical tent. His side was throbbing worse than usual, and he knew he'd pushed too hard the past few days. Inside, a squat, four-armed medic named Dr. Yill was organizing supplies. Without waiting for an invitation, Quentin lowered himself onto the examination table with a groan. "Doctor." Yill snapped a pair of gloves onto his upper hands. "You humans deteriorate rapidly under strain." Quentin shrugged. "We bounce back." "Not without intervention," Dr. Yill said dryly. He peeled back the bandage on Quentin's forearm, inspecting the healing wound. "You have exceeded safe exertion limits by at least 70%. Sounds about right." Dr. Yill tapped a square scanner against Quentin's ribs. It beeped, and Yill's brow ridge furrowed. "2 hairline fractures, additional tissue trauma, you require immobilization." Quentin grimaced. "Yeah, well, duct tape's cheaper." Dr. Yill's lower arms crossed in disapproval. "You will wear a proper brace." After a brief but spirited argument, Quentin grudgingly allowed Yill to wrap his torso in a rigid support vest. It squeezed his ribs just enough to remind him not to twist or lean too much. As he was buttoning up his shirt over the brace, Tavik floated into the tent. "Human Quentin, your presence is requested at the council mound." Quentin raised an eyebrow. "Council mound?" Tavik's skin flushed pink. "A ceremonial gathering site. Your participation is considered essential." With a resigned sigh, Quentin hauled himself up. "Lead the way." The council mound was little more than a broad, circular rise in the desert, ringed with stones. The students and a few instructors had arrayed themselves in a rough spiral, leaving a gap at the center. Quentin limped into the open space, feeling 100 alien eyes on him. Tavik addressed the assembly. "This project has revealed qualities of persistence and innovation not formally documented in our curricula. The methods employed by human Quentin offer insights into resilience under primitive conditions." Jorik stepped forward, carrying a rough-hewn staff of local juniper wood. He presented it to Quentin with both hands. Quentin took it carefully. The staff was heavier than it looked, etched with symbols he didn't recognize. "This is a token of recognition," Jorik said. "You are now an honorary adjunct constructor." Quentin turned the staff over in his hands, genuinely touched. "Well, I'll be damned." Xallari chittered something enthusiastic that needed no translation. The students began a rhythmic clapping, some slapping tails against the ground, others vibrating plates or wings in time. It wasn't exactly music, but it was close enough that Quentin found himself tapping his foot. As the impromptu celebration swelled, Tavik drifted closer. "You have altered the outcomes here more profoundly than anticipated," Quentin chuckled. "Guess that's what happens when you let a stubborn fool into the mix." He stayed long enough to accept a few more awkward congratulations, then slipped away toward the edge of the mound. His ribs were screaming, and the last thing he wanted was to pass out in front of a bunch of aliens. He made it back to his truck just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised oranges and purples. Leaning heavily on the door, he stared back at the tower. It gleamed faintly in the twilight, cables humming softly in the breeze. For a long while, he just stood there, feeling the weight of everything settle into his bones. When Quentin finally climbed into the cab, he left the window down, letting the desert air wash over him. He didn't drive away. Not yet. There was something satisfying about just being still, knowing the thing he'd helped build was out there, holding fast against the coming night. He figured he'd leave in the morning once the painkillers kicked in properly, or maybe he'd stay a little longer. There was always something else to fix. The desert air had baked the ground into a cracked mosaic by mid-morning, and Quentin was already regretting his decision to stay. His ribs twinged with each breath under the rigid brace, and the cut on his forearm itched so fiercely he half considered sawing the bandage off with his pocket knife. Still, he perched stubbornly on a folding chair near the base of the spire, watching the students scurry about like industrious ants. Tavik hovered nearby, scribbling notes on a thin, flexible data sheet. Jorik and Xallari were arguing over measurements at the far end of the site, their voices carrying in the dry breeze. Quentin tapped the staff they'd given him against the ground, fighting the temptation to nod off. The ceremony the night before had run longer than he'd expected, and the bruise on his ribs felt like it had grown a second, more aggressive personality overnight. Tavik finally broke the silence. "Human Quentin, a proposal has been raised." Quentin shifted, grunting as the brace dug into his side. "Lay it on me, Professor." Tavik's body flushed a cautious mauve. Several cadets wished to attempt a secondary structure, one utilizing your leverage principles but applied differently. A bridge, Quentin blinked. A bridge out here, indeed. A suspended crossing between two of the larger rock outcrops to the northeast. Quentin rubbed the back of his neck. You know, bridges are a whole other beast, right? Tension, compression, torsion. It's not just stacking rocks and tightening cables. That is precisely why they seek your guidance, Tavik said. They wish to test adaptability. Quentin swore under his breath, earning a curious tilt from Tavik. Fine, but I'm not hauling another stone. You're getting the full lecture treatment this time. By the time they reached the proposed site, the sun was a white hammer overhead. Quentin shaded his eyes and surveyed the terrain. Two jagged outcrops stood about 30 meters apart, with a dry wash cutting a shallow trench between them. Xallari scuttled up beside him. We can anchor at multiple points, he chirped, antennae twitching. Maybe, Quentin said. He picked up a fist-sized rock and tossed it into the wash. It bounced once, then shattered into powder. But you're gonna need redundancy. If one anchor fails, the whole thing'll peel apart like wet newspaper. Xallari crossed his arms. We will weave multiple tension lines as with the tower. Quentin shook his head. Different game. A bridge pulls sideways, not just down. You need something that can flex without snapping. The students crowded around, hanging on his every word. Quentin pulled a stick from a nearby bush and scratched a rough diagram into the dust, a catenary arch, the simplest form of a suspension bridge. You hang the main cables between the rocks first. Let them sag naturally. Then you hang your deck from those cables. That way, the more weight you put on it, the stronger it gets. Gravity's not just your enemy, it's your tool. There was a long pause. Tavik flickered a thoughtful yellow. Your species wields gravity with casual cruelty. Quentin chuckled, then winced as his ribs protested. We figured out early that nature doesn't care about fair fights. You either work with it or you break. The students set to work immediately, gathering fibers and shaping crude planks from the scrubby mesquite trees. Quentin supervised from a battered camp stool someone dragged over for him, barking corrections whenever a line sagged too much or a support looked suspect. By late afternoon, the first cable was strung between the outcrops. Quentin insisted they use a double braid, twisting two lines together for added elasticity. When the second cable went up, Quentin made them test it by loading a dozen rocks onto a makeshift platform hung from the midpoint. The fibers groaned but held. The students cheered, and Quentin allowed himself a small grin. His ribs still ached like hell, but seeing the bridge take shape eased the stubborn ache in his chest. As twilight bled into the sky, they strung the decking slats, lashing each one carefully to the hanging lines. Quentin forced himself to circle the site twice, checking every knot and anchor. By sheer luck or stubbornness, the bridge stood. Tavik floated closer, the desert wind ruffling the edges of his translator harness. You have enabled them to achieve beyond original scope once again. Quentin lowered himself back into the camp stool with a grunt. Yeah, and I'm about one sneeze away from snapping in half. You require nourishment, Tavik said, and hydration. Quentin nodded. I could eat. An hour later, they sat around a makeshift campfire, a curious mix of humans and aliens picking at a meal cobbled together from field rations, and whatever local plants weren't poisonous. Quentin gnawed on a strip of jerky while Xallari gingerly sampled a roasted prickly pear, making a series of surprised clicking noises. Across the fire, Xallari held up a piece of charred bread and sniffed it suspiciously. This sustenance is inefficient, Quentin laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Yeah, well, efficiency isn't everything. Sometimes you eat because it's there and you're too tired to care. Tavik observed him for a long moment. Your kind persists despite discomfort and inadequate conditions. It is unsettling, Quentin shrugged. You get used to it. Life doesn't hand out gold medals for comfort. As the embers died down, the students began to drift back toward their tents. Quentin stayed behind, staring into the ashes, the warmth easing the worst of the ache from his side. Tavik remained, hovering silently. After a while, Quentin broke the quiet. "You ever think you're trying too hard to make everything perfect?" Tavik's translator buzzed. "Perfection is the standard." "Maybe," Quentin said, "but sometimes good enough gets you a hell of a lot farther." The next morning, Quentin woke to the sound of hammers and shouted instructions. He eased himself upright, ribs protesting every movement, and limped toward the bridge site. The students had started a stress test, marching back and forth across the span in staggered groups. Quentin watched, hands on hips, as the bridge bowed and flexed but refused to fail. When the last group made it safely across, Xallari darted up to him, nearly vibrating with excitement. It held under maximum load, Quentin grinned, feeling the knot of tension in his chest finally loosen. "Told you," Tavik floated up beside him. "The instructional exercise is complete. The cadets have documented every stage. The results will be incorporated into future curricula." Quentin tapped the staff against the ground. "Good. Now you won't have to hire some half-broke human next time." Tavik pulsed a warm gold. "On the contrary, your methods have revealed dimensions we had not anticipated. Future collaborations are likely." Quentin laughed, a genuine, full-throated sound that made his ribs ache all over again. "I'll pencil you in after my next broken bone." They stood there a moment longer, surveying both the soaring tower and the sagging bridge monuments to stubbornness, improvisation, and a healthy disrespect for doing things the easy way. When Quentin finally turned toward his truck, he felt the weight of the staff in his hand, solid and reassuring. His body was battered and he would probably limp for a week, but some part of him felt lighter than it had in years. He tossed the staff into the passenger seat, cranked the engine, and rolled down the window. As he pulled away, the last thing he saw in the rearview mirror was the tower catching the morning light, casting a long, proud shadow across the desert floor. Nothing fancy, nothing perfect, but built to last.